First of all, of course, I'd like to ask you about Trump's ultimatum of 10 days for Putin. And, of course, the reaction of Medvedev, Peskov, and other representatives of this regime. How serious are you taking the 10 days from Trump, what he said, that after that, put sanctions or duties on countries, secondary sanctions? In general, how do you perceive another warning from the 47th President of the United States of America? Yes, with the 47th President of the United States of America, it is certainly difficult to discern his desires and thoughts. But we'll give it a shot. Look, of course, the fact that he is angry with Putin, resentful of him, and no longer wants to meet or communicate with him is a good thing. Because how long can we indulge the aggressor, war criminal, and pretend that he does not notice the aggression, genocide, the development of fascism in Russia, Nazism, fascism in methods, but Nazism in ideology? Thank God he's starting to have an epiphany, unless, of course, it's a game, super subtle, super incomprehensible to us. Now, let's see. Okay, Trump has an epiphany. Let's say, what's next? So what? He has already been told by Medvedev and Peskov, who has already awakened from another bout of drunkenness, to answer, and he has been told that no. We don't agree to anything. We continue the war until we get to our goals. Now this is the time for Trump to say, you so-and-sos, now hold on. But we don't hear that either, because he is saying that I will impose such sanctions that you will ask me for mercy. But we know that the 17,500 sanctions adopted over these 3.5 years by Western countries have unfortunately not been as effective as everyone expected. Not only did they not destroy Putin's economy, but they allowed him to create workarounds, parallel payment systems, and redirect the flow of oil gas energy to other regions. Its buyers are now China and India. India is also a reseller of Russian oil, in fact, on the world market. And so on. And you and I must realize that it is impossible to exclude Russian oil. Let's be primarily oil products, gas to a lesser extent, oil from the world energy balance. That is, there is nothing to replace it in the market of 400 million plus tons of oil annually exported to Russia. 400 plus million tons of oil has nothing to replace it with. If we want to do it today, as Trump proposes, it's essentially the deepest, never-before-seen global energy crisis in terms of its consequences. Is Trump ready for this? I think he's not. So I'm afraid that behind all these loud statements that Putin is a scoundrel and we're not going to talk to him anymore, however much it hides the helplessness of the American administration, which will not be able to impose these sanctions and is not ready to supply Ukraine, or at least we don't see it publicly, is not ready to supply weapons to Ukraine, the necessary amount of weapons, so that Ukraine can not only defend itself. Defending all the time and tolerating bombardment for 3.5 years is a huge period of time. Все время защищаться и терпеть бомбардировки 3,5 года — это огромный срок. I don't even know if there is such an example in world history, when for 3.5 years a country is under constant airstrikes, bombing constantly, forced to hide in a shelter, and so on. Where they are, of course. So I don't know at all. Even if we take World War II, let's say we take Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, still they bombed Soviet cities probably for the first year and a half, and then the war went away. And here it's been 2 years. I don't understand how human patience can be tested. And instead of saying, I'm going to flood Ukraine with weapons, Trump is saying, I'm going to flood Putin with sanctions. And that's what I don't understand. I understand more the position of Europe. Let's go with this Trump. Let's give him money. Let him give us weapons. And not all countries said so, but nevertheless, at least there is some logic here. And what logic is there now in that 17.533 sanction? That's why, on the one hand, it's good news that Trump said Putin is not a good man. He won't communicate with him anymore. As he doesn't do anything, he gave him ultimatum. But all we see so far is, I will impose sanctions. This is where I have big doubts, because to undermine all global trade, to try to eliminate 15+% of the global energy market overnight, I don't know what to replace it with. There's nothing to replace it with. What's he going to ask Iran to increase production by 400 million tons of oil? Or Iraq? What country is capable of replacing this huge amount of energy resources on the world market? I don't understand it yet. Of course, I am not an expert like many experts in the oil market. I may not know something. I may not understand the geopolitical paths of energy carriers and so on. But it's pretty clear that the 7.5% or 7.8% reduction in oil production in the 1980s caused a terrible energy crisis. And there's 15+%. So on the one hand, I'm encouraged that Trump is finally starting to say normal things. And on the other hand, he doesn't speak fully, and the medicine he suggests, it may not work. It's no longer in effect for 3-1-2 years as we expected it to be. I mean, medication in the form of harsh economic sanctions. We don't have a lot of time left before Trump ultimatum expires. What they're going to propose, what they're going to come up with, how they're going to proceed, we will find out in just a week and a half. Yes, Gennady, you say you can't substitute, but India has said that it is prepared not to buy Russian oil if there are any secondary sanctions. This was also stated by the Indian oil minister. And I understand that now the main buyers of Russian oil are China and Turkey. And here's what Trump is proposing. I understand that he's proposing secondary sanctions to those countries that buy that oil. And I'd also like to bring up the deal that the EU and the US signed that over the next 3 years, the EU is committed to buying $750 billion worth of US energy. Can this be taken as a matter of fact that the Putin regime has been completely pushed out of the old continent and has closed their entrance to this big market? It was mostly about gas, really. It's basically a gas deal. Yes, the Americans can substitute gas. It is clear that Europe has been doing a lot for this. It's built a bunch of terminals there. It's built a bunch of infrastructure for liquefied natural gas that can be delivered from the United States, from the Gulf region, from Arab oil gas producing countries. And so on. So there's a lot of things that have been done there, including different streams, different pipelines. But this is about oil. Most of Putin's war is based on oil revenues as the main source. Gas is ancillary. It's worse for sales. We know Gazprom has giant problems selling gas. We all know that. Yes, of course it makes it harder for Putin to act. To be honest, for me, you said the surprising news that India is ready to give up. Basically, I was counting on the fact that India is building a democracy after all. It must somehow make up its mind on this issue, on the fundamental question of the clash of two systems, democracy and totalitarianism. But thank God if that's what India decides to do. I don't understand yet because India has been reselling this oil, and now these countries, they can go directly to Putin, where it resold this oil, having its share, so to speak. It is ready, in general, apparently, to give it up. This is the right decision of India, after all, will come to a democratic world and not some alliance that is trying to undermine this world and destroy the entire world order. But God willing, India will implement this decision. But beyond China, that leaves a bunch of other countries. Turkey doesn't occupy such a large, though still a large country, under 100 million. After all, it is not a key buyer of Russian oil. We have to see if India now says, yes, we are ready to do it, but within 3 years. And is Ukraine ready to fight for 3 more years with all that Putin is doing and currently has serious advantages in the air, in missile and bomb strikes, and huge massive strikes with various types of drones and so on? So you have to understand the details. As they say, the devil is in the details. I can only applaud this statement by India. I did not know it, and you have now told me about him. I can only be glad that such a statement followed from the Indian side. But you have to understand the details of how it's going to play out in detail, because maybe it's going to be stretched out over a period of time, or maybe China will end up buying. Clearly, he's unlikely to sell given their relationship, but still. Well, I'll be glad if my fears don't come true. I'm only going to be happy about it. I'm just trying to build a picture of what it would actually look like in real life. And it's not really coming together in my head. Gennady regarding supplies. I would prefer Trump kept the promise he made during his campaign, I will flood Ukraine with weapons. I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think this deal with the European Union, does it involve the supply of arms as well? Because all Trump has said is, we're going to be selling a lot of arms to Europe and European members of NATO. How much faith is there to believe that Trump, as he promised in 2023, that he would decide there was nothing to talk about and just sell weapons? Because we see Steve Witkoff has stepped aside. J.D. Vance doesn't talk about the war. Marco Rubio very rarely brings it up. My impression, Gennady, is that the entire top brass in America, in the White House, is simply distancing itself from Russia's war against Ukraine, realizing that they cannot solve this issue and will just quietly sell weapons and make money on it. In fact, that's what America has been doing under Biden. The fact is that the American defense complex, the military-industrial complex, it is swamped with orders as far back as 2036. At least I've heard this from military experts, that for many years to come, 100+% utilization of the U.S. military complex and a huge number of countries have now placed orders for modern U.S. military products, from the F-35 airplanes, of which there are more and more in the world, to multiple launch rocket systems, to artillery. And other things. I mean, the Americans have already accelerated their defense industrial complex by more than 100%. That is the maximum load, and this load will be for many years to come because the quality of American weapons is really very good. And European weapons are good, but the Americans are still using their influence in the world to sell these weapons. I know the situation not very well, but I have heard something about the situation in Bulgaria regarding the purchase of airplanes. The Swedes offered everything much better, cheaper, and bigger, but the American influence played its role, and the Bulgarians bought airplanes in the United States of America, not in Europe. So they are doing it anyway. The only question is America going to give something, or is America only going to sell? That is the question. Because the capacity of the U.S. military-industrial sector is not sufficient for a more accelerated re-equipping of Europe and NATO as an alliance with new U.S. weapons. That's the problem, and that's why Germany says, if we give away all our ATGMs, we will have nothing left. Spain says, if we give up our combat systems, we'll have nothing left. Italy says, yes, we're willing to give, but we need to keep something for our own needs because our orders are still being processed. We haven't gotten the replacement with this one yet, and so on and so forth. Every country roughly reasoned in this paradigm. Nevertheless, I believe, perhaps wrongly, that Europe has enough resources to provide Ukraine with the necessary number of modern weapons, including weapons suitable for offensive combat. And it needs to be done. Will Trump give charity? That is, whether it will be delivered by understanding its responsibility for the fate of the democratic system for the entire free world. That question, of course, is off the table today. Trump says, no, we will only sell. This, of course, is not very good and not very beautiful behavior of a great power, the leader of the world democratic system. But you and I have to endure it now, unfortunately, because that's the way of the American administration, which says a lot, does less. And it all comes down to some kind of bazaar, not even a market. They're not businessmen, they're bargainers, according to us. Because it's not a bargaining situation. When there is a fire, there is no time for bargaining. It is necessary to extinguish the fire and afterwards to sort out who was right and who was guilty. That's why, let it be. As they say, beggars can't be choosers. And the willingness to sell these weapons. Let them at least sell. Europe is ready to buy. Gennady, how do you think the Kremlin views Trump's threats? Because Medvedev came out there and threatened the U.S. that we are not Israel or Iran. And if you threaten us, that threat leads to a war not between Russia and Ukraine, but between the United States of America and the Russian Federation. How serious is this? How scared is the Kremlin by these Trump ultimatums? As we can see, scared because otherwise they wouldn't have come out of every crevice and started threatening. I mean, they work on bluffs, they work on threats, they work on intimidation, they work on blackmail. So it works for them. If they didn't react, they would say, no, we have other plans, you don't want to do it, don't do it. We continue our actions from here. They started intimidating right away. So, of course, it affects their expectation. Affects their view of world events. Trump's decision is certainly troubling, but they do not yet understand how it will end. They are blackmailing the world just in case, but they don't realize yet how it will end and in what direction the further development of events will go. They too will wait, they will intimidate, they will blackmail, they will bluff. It's inevitable. I've said all along from the early days of the war that unfortunately you and I will have to go through nuclear blackmail. And he continues all these 3.5 years because they have no other arguments. By the way, here are experts from a British university saying that Putin could mine the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. How serious do you take this, and do you think it's realistic, under different odds in this war, that Putin could come to such a very scary decision? I have always said, and continue to say, that there is not yet a critical situation in this war. The critical situation will be when Putin's reluctance to defeat is tolerated, he will need to make a choice. And that's going to be the most critical point because he's really not adequate. He inadequately assesses the world political situation, the balance of power, and so on and so forth. He resides in the paradigm of Peter's Yard, where you had to fist your right to respect or tolerate something like that, but generally be prepared for anything and act in every way possible. This is the psychology he put at the heart of public policy. And in that sense, of course, all that can stop him is the risk of his own death. That's why I expect him to pull any kind of trick, any kind of action. He has no moral, ethical restraints or limitations. Therefore, I cannot rule out this terrible act, the mining of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with the threat of its explosion. This can also be an element of blackmail. Gennady, thank you for the conversation, for taking the time to discuss important processes, trends. We will wait to see what Trump decides and what the consequences will look like after his ultimatum. We are now living in anticipation of some major shifts, and I hope they will be positive after all. Thank you. Opposition politician Gennady Gudkov was with us. Subscribe, comment, share our conversation. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. See you.